The morning sun barely peeked through the heavy clouds as Dr. Sarah Washington rushed through the busy streets of downtown Boston. Her heart was racing, not because of her brisk walk, but because of the court summons clutched tightly in her hand. The paper had been sitting on her desk for weeks, almost forgotten among the piles of research papers and grant proposals that consumed her daily life. Today was supposed to be different. At 2 p.m., she was scheduled to present her groundbreaking cancer research to some of the most influential scientists in the country. The presentation she had spent months preparing was safely stored on her laptop, which bounced against her hip as she walked. But first, she had to deal with this parking ticket. The rain started falling just as she reached the courthouse steps. Sarah pulled her old rain jacket closer, covering her professional attire, a crisp blue suit she had chosen specifically for her presentation. The jacket had seen better days, but it was reliable, just like its owner. Her usually neat braids were starting to frizz in the humidity, and she wished she had remembered to bring an umbrella. As she pushed through the heavy courthouse doors, Sarah checked her watch again. 9:45 a.m. She had exactly 15 minutes before her scheduled appearance. The building was a maze of corridors and offices, filled with people rushing in different directions. The smell of coffee and paper filled the air, mixing with the musty scent of old books and worn wooden benches. Finding her courtroom, Sarah took a seat on one of the hard wooden benches, pulling out her phone to check her emails. 3 urgent messages from her laboratory assistant popped up immediately. The cell cultures they had been working on for months needed attention. Sarah's fingers flew across the screen as she typed quick, precise instructions to her team. A young intern at her lab had once asked why Dr. Washington, with all her achievements and credentials, still did hands-on lab work. She had smiled and explained that science was like breathing to her, essential and natural. From the moment she had received her first microscope at age 12, Sarah knew she would dedicate her life to unlocking the mysteries hidden in cells and molecules. The courtroom was filling up now. Sarah observed the people around her, nervous defendants, confident lawyers in expensive suits, tired-looking clerks shuffling papers. Nobody seemed to notice the woman in the worn rain jacket, and that was fine with her. Few would guess that under that simple jacket was one of the country's leading molecular biologists, whose research was changing the way doctors approached cancer treatment. Her mind wandered to her laboratory at the university, where important experiments were waiting. The new treatment protocol she had developed showed promising results in early trials. If everything went well with today's presentation, her team could secure additional funding to expand their research. Lives could be changed, but first, this ticket needed to be handled. Sarah pulled out the citation from her briefcase, reviewing it one more time. The ticket was for parking in a loading zone while she ran into her lab late one night to check on a time-sensitive experiment. She had only been gone for 15 minutes, but that was enough time for a parking enforcement officer to leave the bright orange ticket on her windshield. The sound of a door opening caught her attention. The bailiff entered the courtroom, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "All rise," he called out, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Sarah stood, straightening her rain jacket and running a hand over her hair in a futile attempt to smooth it. As she waited for the judge to enter, Sarah mentally rehearsed what she would say. She believed in taking responsibility for her actions, but also felt the need to explain the circumstances. In her bag, along with her laptop and presentation materials, was proof of her emergency lab visit that night, detailed logs of the experiment that couldn't wait. Little did she know that this routine court appearance would turn into something much more significant. As she stood there, looking more like a harried student than a distinguished scientist, Sarah Washington was about to become part of a story that would challenge assumptions and change perspectives in ways she never expected. The door behind the judge's bench opened, and Sarah took a deep breath. She had faced tough questioning from scientific review boards and defended her research countless times, but something about this morning made her nervous. Maybe it was the rushing, or the rain, or the pressing weight of her upcoming presentation. Whatever it was, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, ready to face whatever came next. Judge Michael Barrett entered the courtroom with the same stern expression he had worn for the past 15 years on the bench. His black robe swished around his ankles as he took his seat, adjusting his reading glasses while scanning the day's docket. The morning's cases were mostly routine: parking violations, minor traffic infractions, and small claims disputes. When he called out Washington Sarah, his eyes settled on a woman in a worn rain jacket who stood up from the middle row. His first impression was not favorable. In his experience, defendants who appeared in court dressed carelessly often showed the same lack of regard for the law. He noted her slightly disheveled appearance and what he interpreted as impatience in her posture. "Ms. Washington," he began, emphasizing the "Ms." with a slightly condescending tone, "you're here for parking in a loading zone at—" He glanced down at the citation, 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday night. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" His voice carried the weariness of someone who had heard every possible excuse. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Barrett cut her off almost immediately when she began explaining about her laboratory experiment. "Ms. Washington, I've heard many creative excuses in this courtroom, but late-night experiments is a new one." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, and the judge allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The corner of Sarah's mouth twitched, but she maintained her composure. She tried again to explain, reaching for her bag to pull out her documentation. Judge Barrett waved his hand dismissively. "The sign clearly states no parking, loading zone only. It doesn't make exceptions for late-night activities, whatever they might be." From her desk, Court Clerk Patricia Martinez watched the exchange with growing concern. There was something familiar about the defendant, but she couldn't quite place it. The way Dr. Washington carried herself, her vocabulary, and her attempt to present documentation all suggested this was no ordinary case of parking violation. Judge Barrett leaned forward in his chair, his fingers interlaced on the bench before him. "Ms. Washington, this court's time is valuable. The fact is, you parked illegally. Your presence here today suggests you either can't or won't simply pay the fine. Which is it?" His tone carried years of dealing with what he perceived as frivolous excuses and time-wasting appeals. The morning light filtering through the high courthouse windows cast shadows across the judge's face, deepening the lines of disapproval around his mouth. He had seen thousands of defendants stand before him, and he prided himself on being able to read people quickly. To him, Sarah Washington appeared to be another person trying to talk her way out of a simple fine. Some of the other defendants waiting their turn watched the exchange with a mix of sympathy and relief that they weren't in her position. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the judge was being unusually harsh for a simple parking violation. "Your Honor, if I could just explain." Sarah began again, her voice steady despite the growing frustration evident in her eyes. She held a folder of papers in her hands, but Judge Barrett's attention had already shifted to his computer screen. "The fine is $300, he announced, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Plus court costs." He looked up at her over his reading glasses, expecting to see the usual signs of defeat or anger. Instead, he was met with a calm, measured gaze that, for just a moment, made him question his quick judgment. Court Clerk Martinez was now frantically searching through her phone, certain she had seen this woman somewhere important. The way Dr. Washington handled herself, with dignity despite the judge's dismissive attitude, sparked her memory of a recent news article. Judge Barrett was already reaching for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case, when he noticed his clerk's unusual behavior. Patricia Martinez was typically the picture of professional composure, but now she was urgently trying to catch his eye while looking between her phone and the defendant. The morning rain continued to drum against the courthouse windows, creating a steady backdrop to the tense scene. Sarah Washington stood straight, her rain jacket now partially open to reveal glimpses of a professional suit underneath, but Judge Barrett had already made up his mind. He had seen too many people try to talk their way out of simple violations, and he wasn't about to let another one waste the court's time. Little did he know, his next few minutes would force him to confront his own biases in a way that would change his approach to justice forever. The tension in courtroom 302 had reached a palpable level. Dr. Sarah Washington stood firmly at the defendant's podium, her hands clasped in front of her as Judge Barrett continued his lecture. The fine he had just imposed was significantly higher than the standard rate for a parking violation, a fact that hadn't escaped the notice of the more experienced courtroom regulars. Furthermore, Judge Barrett continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd cultivated over his years on the bench, "Your apparent lack of respect for the court's time is concerning." He tapped his pen against the desk rhythmically, a habit he'd developed when he felt particularly irritated with a defendant. Sarah attempted to speak once more, her voice steady despite the growing frustration. "Your Honor, I have documentation that proves I was attending to a critical medical research experiment that night." The judge's hand shot up, silencing her mid-sentence. "Ms. Washington," he interrupted, emphasizing the Ms. again, "we've already established that creative excuses won't work here. Medical research." He let out a short, dismissive laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Next time, try something more believable." Patricia Martinez, the court clerk, was now frantically waving a piece of paper she just printed from her computer. Her face had turned slightly red from the effort of trying to catch the judge's attention without disrupting court proceedings. She had finally remembered where she'd seen Dr. Washington, just last week, on the front page of the Boston Globe's science section. Several other people in the courtroom had begun to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A young lawyer in the back, who recognized Dr. Washington from a recent university fundraiser, was whispering urgently to his colleague. The bailiff, sensing the growing discomfort in the room, took a few steps closer to the judge's bench. "If you're finished wasting this court's time," Judge Barrett continued, shuffling papers on his desk, "you can pay the fine at the clerk's office. Next case." He reached for his gavel, ready to dismiss what he viewed as another routine case of a defendant trying to avoid responsibility. But Sarah Washington wasn't finished. With calm determination, she opened her briefcase and pulled out her university ID badge, holding it up. "Your Honor, I am Dr. Sarah Washington, lead researcher at the Boston Medical Research Institute. The experiment I was monitoring that night was part of a crucial cancer treatment trial." The judge's hand froze midair, his gavel suspended. A few gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Patricia Martinez had finally managed to make her way to the judge's bench, clutching the newspaper printout in her hands. "I apologize for parking in the loading zone," Sarah continued, her voice clear and professional, "but I had to check on cell cultures that represented months of research and millions in grant funding. 15 minutes could have meant the difference between success and failure for a treatment that could save lives." Judge Barrett's face had begun to redden, whether from embarrassment or anger wasn't immediately clear. He glanced down at the paper his clerk had just placed before him, then back at the woman standing before him. The contrast between his initial assumptions and the reality of who she was began to sink in. The article in front of him featured a photo of Dr. Washington in her lab coat, standing next to sophisticated medical equipment. The headline read, "Revolutionary Cancer Treatment Breakthrough. Dr. Sarah Washington leads groundbreaking research." The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. Everyone waited to see how the judge would handle this revelation. The morning rain continued to tap against the windows, providing the only sound in the tense atmosphere. Sarah stood quietly, her professional demeanor never wavering. She'd faced prejudice before in her career, but this was different. This was an opportunity to challenge assumptions in a way that might create real change. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. The paper in his hands trembled slightly as he read more details about the woman he had just berated. The same woman who, according to the article, had just received one of the largest research grants in the state's history. Patricia Martinez stood nearby, a mix of satisfaction and concern on her face. She had worked with Judge Barrett long enough to know that this moment would either bring out his worst defensive instincts or become a turning point in his career. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. The judge's next words would either escalate the situation or transform it into something meaningful. The weight of that choice hung heavy in the air of courtroom 302. The 10-minute recess Judge Barrett called felt like the longest of Patricia Martinez's career. She watched as he retreated to his chambers, the newspaper article still clutched tightly in his hand. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the now quiet courtroom. Inside his chambers, Judge Barrett sank heavily into his leather chair, spreading the newspaper article across his desk. His hands trembled slightly as he read the full story about Dr. Washington's achievements. The article detailed how she had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the country's leading molecular biologists. Her research team had recently made a breakthrough that could potentially revolutionize cancer treatment, particularly for underserved communities. Patricia knocked gently on his door before entering with another stack of papers. "Your Honor," she began cautiously, "there's more." She laid out printouts from scientific journals, university press releases, and even a feature from Time magazine that had named Dr. Washington one of the 100 most influential people the previous year. The judge's face grew paler with each document he reviewed. She was trying to tell me about her research, he muttered, more to himself than to Patricia. I wouldn't even let her speak. His finger traced over a photograph of Dr. Washington receiving the National Science Foundation's highest honor from the president. Meanwhile, in the courthouse hallway, Dr. Washington sat quietly on a wooden bench, checking her phone. 3 more urgent messages from her lab team had arrived, and her presentation was now just hours away. Despite the morning's events, her main concern remained the cancer patients who were waiting for her research results. Back in his chambers, Judge Barrett stood and walked to the window, watching the rain that continued to fall outside. In his 15 years on the bench, he had prided himself on being fair and just. Now, in the harsh light of his own prejudice, those years of supposed fairness seemed to unravel before his eyes. Patricia, he said finally, turning from the window, how many other times have I done this? How many other people have I silenced or dismissed based on? He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. His clerk had been witnessing such moments for years, staying silent out of respect for his position. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as Patricia carefully considered her response. Your Honor, she began diplomatically, perhaps this is an opportunity rather than just a mistake. She pulled out one final document, a recent study on bias in the judicial system that had been making waves in legal circles. Judge Barrett picked up the study, his judicial demeanor momentarily cracking as he realized the full weight of what had just transpired in his courtroom. The woman he had dismissed so casually was not only a renowned scientist, but someone whose work could save countless lives. Lives that might even include his own family members, friends, or colleagues. Outside, the crowds in the courthouse hallway had thinned as people returned to the courtroom. Dr. Washington stood up, straightening her rain jacket. Despite everything, she maintained the same calm, dignified presence she had shown throughout the morning. The bailiff appeared at the chamber door. Your Honor, recess is almost over. The courtroom is full. Seems word has gotten around about. He gestured vaguely, uncomfortable with finishing the sentence. Judge Barrett nodded, gathering the papers from his desk. His hands had stopped shaking, but his face showed the strain of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth about themselves. Patricia watched as he took several deep breaths, straightening his robes with unusual care. This isn't just about Dr. Washington anymore, is it? He asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. The morning's events had forced him to confront questions that would reshape his entire approach to justice. The final minutes of recess ticked away as Judge Barrett prepared himself to return to the courtroom. Through his chamber window, he could see the rain finally beginning to clear, sunlight breaking through the clouds. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Patricia organized the articles and documents into a neat folder, adding it to the court record. In her 20 years as a court clerk, she had never seen a simple parking violation case transform into such a powerful moment of reckoning. As the bailiff prepared to announce the court's return to session, Judge Barrett straightened his shoulders and took one final deep breath. He knew that what he did next would define not just this case, but his entire legacy as a judge. The weight of that responsibility and the opportunity it presented filled him with equal measures of anxiety and determination. When Judge Barrett returned to the courtroom, his eyes saw Dr. Washington in an entirely different light. The worn rain jacket that had earlier led to his dismissive assumptions now parted to reveal a tailored professional suit underneath. The ID badge hanging from her neck caught the light, its University Medical Center logo clearly visible. Her briefcase, which he had barely noticed before, sat open on the table before her. Scientific papers and research documents were neatly organized inside, their headers bearing the logos of prestigious medical journals. A laptop covered in laboratory safety stickers peeked out from beneath the papers. Dr. Washington, Judge Barrett began, emphasizing the doctor with the same intensity he had earlier used for Mays. His voice carried a different tone now, one of respect and, more notably, regret. The packed courtroom leaned forward, sensing the shift in his demeanor. Sarah stood straight, her composure unchanged from earlier. The morning light now streaming through the courthouse windows highlighted her professional appearance, making the judge wonder how he had missed so many obvious signs of her credentials. Her hair, though slightly frizzy from the rain, was neatly styled in a way that spoke of someone who took care with their appearance despite prioritizing more important matters. Your Honor, she responded, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence she used when presenting at medical conferences. The scientific papers she had tried to show earlier were still in her hands, their importance now evident to everyone in the courtroom. Judge Barrett removed his reading glasses, a gesture he rarely made during proceedings. I see here that you were attempting to explain the circumstances of your parking violation. He gestured to the stack of articles on his bench. Something about time-sensitive cancer research? The judge noticed details he had overlooked in his earlier haste. The dark circles under her eyes suggesting long hours in the laboratory, the slight stains on her fingers from medical dyes, the way she organized her documents with the precision of a scientist. A young intern from the local newspaper who had slipped into the courtroom after hearing whispers about the case scribbled furiously in his notebook. The story was already taking shape in his mind. How a prestigious judge's preconceptions had nearly interfered with crucial medical research. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied, finally able to explain her situation. That night, we were monitoring the response of cancer cells to a new treatment protocol. She pulled out a laboratory log, its pages filled with detailed timestamps and observations. 15 minutes could have meant the difference between success and failure in our trials. The courtroom remained silent as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of someone whose work touched countless lives. Even the usual shuffling and whispers had ceased as everyone listened to her explanation. Judge Barrett studied the laboratory log she had presented, noting the precise handwriting and detailed documentation. His eyes caught sight of the grant amounts listed in the newspaper article, millions of dollars invested in research that he had casually dismissed as a mere excuse. Patricia Martinez watched from her clerk's desk with quiet satisfaction as the judge's expression shifted from embarrassment to genuine interest. She had seen countless cases in this courtroom, but few had offered such a clear opportunity for growth and understanding. Dr. Washington, the judge continued, his voice softer now, I see here that your research team is working on treatments that could help thousands of patients. He held up one of the articles, a photograph showing her team in their laboratory, surrounded by advanced medical equipment. Sarah nodded, glancing at her watch. In a few hours, she would be presenting their latest findings to the medical board. The irony wasn't lost on her. How this minor parking violation had led to such a significant moment in the courthouse. The morning sun had fully emerged now, flooding the courtroom with warm light. It illuminated the degrees and certificates hanging on the wall behind the judge's bench, symbols of authority that suddenly seemed to carry less weight compared to the groundbreaking research the scientists conducted. Judge Barrett straightened in his chair, acutely aware that every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him. His next words would need to do more than just address a parking violation. They would need to acknowledge his own failing and set a new precedent for fairness in his courtroom. The silence stretched on for another moment as he gathered his thoughts, preparing to transform what had begun as a routine traffic case into something far more meaningful. The weight of his earlier prejudice and the opportunity for redemption hung heavy in the air. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, his usual courtroom confidence replaced by genuine humility. Dr. Washington, I believe I owe you an apology. The words echoed through the silent courtroom, carrying more weight than any verdict he had ever delivered. I would like to reopen this case properly, he continued, shuffling through the papers before him. Please, share with the court the full circumstances of that evening. His tone had transformed from condescending to respectful, a change noticed by every person present. Sarah opened her laboratory logs, her movements precise and methodical. That Tuesday night, we were conducting critical trials for a new cancer treatment, she explained. Our team had been monitoring cell cultures for 72 hours straight. These cultures represented months of research and millions in grant funding. The judge listened intently as she described how she had received an urgent call from her laboratory assistant about unexpected changes in the cell cultures. Every minute was crucial, she continued. The loading zone was the only available space near the laboratory entrance. I made a choice between following parking regulations and potentially losing months of cancer research. Members of the gallery leaned forward, absorbed by her explanation. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases, found himself drawn into her story. The young newspaper intern's pen moved rapidly across his notepad, capturing every word. Your research, Judge Barrett said thoughtfully, is saving lives, isn't it? He held up the newspaper article featuring her work. While I was concerned about a parking space, you're concerned about finding a cure for cancer. Sarah's expression remained professional, but her eyes showed a glimmer of passion when she spoke about her work. "We've had promising results, Your Honor. Last month, our treatment showed a 60% success rate in preliminary trials. That's why every minute counts in our laboratory." The judge removed his reading glasses, a gesture that signaled deep contemplation to those familiar with his habits. "Dr. Washington, would you be willing to share your perspective on something?" When she nodded, he continued, "How often do assumptions and prejudices create barriers in your field?" The courtroom grew even quieter, if possible. Sarah took a moment before responding, choosing her words carefully. "Prejudice doesn't announce itself, Your Honor. It often hides behind small decisions, quick judgments, and unopened doors. In science, like in justice, we must constantly question our assumptions." Judge Barrett nodded slowly, her words striking a chord. "The fine I imposed earlier was excessive and based on—" He paused. "Assumptions I should not have made. I'm vacating that decision." He looked directly at Sarah. "However, I believe this incident presents an opportunity for both of us to serve our community better." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The morning's hostility had transformed into something unexpected, a chance for meaningful dialogue. Instead of a fine, the judge continued, "Would you consider speaking at our upcoming legal symposium about bias in professional settings? Your perspective as a scientist could be invaluable to our legal community." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Patricia Martinez smiled from her clerk's desk, knowing she had witnessed something rare, a moment of genuine growth and understanding in a system often criticized for its rigidity. "I would be honored, Your Honor," Sarah replied, "though I suggest we also discuss how emergency protocols could be established for research facilities to prevent similar situations in the future." Judge Barrett actually smiled, a rare sight in his courtroom. "An excellent suggestion, Dr. Washington. Perhaps we can turn this morning's misunderstanding into something constructive for our community." He made several notes in the case file before looking up again. "As for the parking violation itself, given the emergency nature of the situation and your service to public health, I'm reducing the fine to a warning." He paused before adding, "Though I trust you'll keep emergency protocols in mind for future situations." Sarah nodded, gathering her documents. "Yes, Your Honor. And thank you for being willing to listen, eventually." The slight emphasis on the last word carried no bitterness, only an acknowledgement of how far they'd come in one morning. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows had grown stronger, symbolic of the clarity that had emerged from the morning's confusion. As Sarah checked her watch, remembering her upcoming presentation, Judge Barrett made one final note in his records. Not about the case, but about the day he learned to look past his first impressions. The courtroom had witnessed more than just the resolution of a parking ticket. It had seen the beginning of a change that would ripple through the justice system in ways yet to be discovered. 6 months after the memorable courtroom encounter, the Boston County Courthouse had undergone significant changes. Judge Barrett's experience with Dr. Washington had sparked a transformation that reached far beyond their initial interaction. The once rigid halls now hosted regular training sessions on implicit bias, with judges and court staff actively participating. On this particular morning, Judge Barrett stood at the podium in the courthouse's main conference room, addressing a group of newly appointed judges. "I learned my most important lesson about justice from a parking ticket," he began, drawing curious looks from his audience. He shared the story of that rainy morning, not sparing himself from criticism as he described his prejudiced behavior. The training program he had initiated was making waves in the legal community. Other courthouses across the state had begun requesting information about implementing similar reforms. Local news outlets had picked up the story, highlighting how one incident had catalyzed meaningful change in the justice system. Dr. Washington had become a regular speaker at legal seminars, bringing her scientist's perspective to discussions about bias in professional settings. Her presentations always began with the story of that rainy morning, using it as a launching point to discuss broader issues of prejudice and assumption in both the legal and scientific communities. "The scientific method teaches us to question our assumptions," she would explain to rooms full of legal professionals. "In the courtroom, as in the laboratory, our preconceptions can blind us to the truth if we're not careful." Her words had particular impact coming from someone who had experienced such bias firsthand. The courthouse had also established new protocols for emergency situations involving research facilities. A special parking permit system had been implemented, allowing scientists conducting time-sensitive experiments to legally park in designated areas during emergencies. Several other research institutions in the city had adopted similar systems, preventing future incidents like the one that had brought Dr. Washington to court. Judge Barrett's transformation was evident in his daily work. His colleagues noticed how he took more time with each case, listening carefully to explanations he might have dismissed in the past. The average length of his hearings had increased, but so had the satisfaction of those leaving his courtroom, regardless of the verdicts. Patricia Martinez, the court clerk who had helped bring about this change, had been promoted to chief administrative clerk. Part of her new role involved coordinating the bias training programs and maintaining relationships with community organizations. She often thought back to that morning, marveling at how one small action, showing the judge that newspaper article, had led to such significant changes. The young newspaper intern who had witnessed the original incident had written a series of articles about the transformation of the courthouse. His pieces had caught the attention of national media, leading to broader discussions about bias in the justice system. The story had become a case study in how personal growth could lead to institutional change. Local law schools had incorporated the incident into their ethics curriculum, using it as an example of how unconscious bias could affect legal proceedings and how institutions could work to address these issues. Judge Barrett was occasionally invited to speak to law students, sharing his experience with future legal professionals. Dr. Washington's laboratory had also seen positive changes. The publicity surrounding the courthouse incident had drawn attention to her research, leading to increased funding and support. She had used this platform to advocate for better understanding between the scientific and legal communities, organizing regular meetings between researchers and legal professionals. The courthouse hallways now displayed a series of photographs showing diverse professionals in various fields: scientists, judges, doctors, lawyers, all working in their respective environments. Each image carried a simple message: look beyond your first impression. Judge Barrett would often pause before these photos, remembering the lesson he had learned that rainy morning. One of the most significant changes was the establishment of a community advisory board that brought together legal professionals, scientists, and community members. This board met monthly to discuss ways to make the justice system more equitable and accessible to all members of the community. As the 6-month mark approached, Judge Barrett sat in his chambers one evening, reviewing the changes that had taken place. On his desk sat a framed copy of the newspaper article about Dr. Washington that had opened his eyes that morning. Next to it was a more recent article highlighting the courthouse's transformation and its impact on the community. The story of the judge and the scientist had become more than just an anecdote about prejudice. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that growth was possible at any stage of one's career, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from unexpected places. 1 year after the parking ticket incident, the Boston County Courthouse's main auditorium was filled to capacity. The occasion was the annual Legal and Scientific Cooperation Symposium, an event that had grown from a simple idea into a significant gathering of professionals from both fields. Dr. Sarah Washington stood at the podium, her presence commanding the attention of every person in the room. Gone was the rain jacket from that memorable morning. Today she wore an elegant blue suit that reflected her dual role as both scientist and public speaker. Behind her, a large screen displayed the results of her team's cancer research, now in advanced clinical trials. "A year ago, I walked into this courthouse expecting to pay a parking ticket," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "Instead, I became part of a story about change, growth, and the importance of looking beyond our first impressions." In the front row, Judge Barrett listened intently. His hair had a bit more gray now, but his eyes showed a wisdom that hadn't been there before. Next to him sat Patricia Martinez, recently appointed as the courthouse's Director of Community Relations, a position created specifically to build bridges between the legal system and the community. The symposium had drawn attendees from across the country. Representatives from 20 other court systems had come to learn about the changes implemented in Boston. The program, now known as the Barrett-Washington Initiative, had become a model for judicial reform nationwide. Dr. Washington continued her presentation, sharing how her research had progressed over the past year. The cancer treatment protocol she had been developing that rainy morning was now showing promising results in clinical trials. Sometimes, she noted with a slight smile, the most important breakthroughs come from our most challenging moments. Judge Barrett was scheduled to speak next. On his lap rested a speech about how their chance encounter had led to systematic changes in the courthouse. The numbers were impressive. Complaints about judicial bias had decreased by 40%, community trust in the legal system had increased significantly, and other institutions had begun implementing similar training programs. The young newspaper intern, now a full-time journalist, sat in the audience taking notes. His initial story about the parking ticket incident had won a local journalism award and sparked a series of articles about institutional change. He had documented every step of the courthouse's transformation. During the break between sessions, Dr. Washington and Judge Barrett met in the same hallway where their story had begun. The worn wooden benches were still there, but now they were surrounded by new additions: community information boards, scientific education displays, and artwork celebrating diversity in professional fields. "Did you ever imagine," Sarah asked, "that a parking ticket would lead to all this?" She gestured to the crowded hallway where legal professionals and scientists mingled freely, sharing ideas and perspectives. Judge Barrett shook his head, smiling. "It reminded me that justice isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding the human stories behind each case." His chambers now featured a small plaque reading, "Listen first, judge second," a daily reminder of the lesson he had learned. The afternoon sessions focused on practical applications of the program. Other courts shared their experiences implementing similar changes, and research institutions discussed new protocols for emergency situations. The partnership between the legal and scientific communities had grown beyond anyone's expectations. As the day drew to a close, Dr. Washington's research team presented their latest findings. The cancer treatment protocol she had been monitoring that rainy morning was now helping patients across the country. Several were in attendance, living testimony to the importance of her work. Judge Barrett's closing remarks captured the spirit of transformation that had taken place. "1 year ago, I made a mistake based on prejudice and assumption," he admitted to the packed auditorium. "But that mistake led to something remarkable, a reminder that it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to change." The symposium ended with the announcement of a new scholarship program, jointly funded by the courthouse and the Medical Research Institute. It would support students interested in building bridges between law and science, ensuring that the lessons learned would be passed on to future generations. As the attendees filed out of the courthouse that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows through the same windows that had witnessed the beginning of this story 1 year ago. Dr. Washington and Judge Barrett stood at the top of the courthouse steps, watching people leave with new ideas and renewed purpose. The parking spot that had started it all now bore a small plaque. "Sometimes justice begins with a second look." It served as a daily reminder to everyone entering the courthouse that true justice requires more than just following rules. It requires understanding, growth, and the courage to admit when we're wrong.